Welcome to this week's edition of It's the Economy. I'm your host for this evening, Claudia Cragg. To begin our show tonight, we talk with investigative financial reporter, author of Debt Generation, and BBC filmmaker David Malone on the always especially knotty subject of geopolitics. As in a super fantastic war of the worlds, in his opinion, he says the French are teaming up with Qatar versus the House of Saud to free themselves from the Russian use of energy as a political weapon. Furthermore, you'll hear him argue that powers outside Syria would be content, he argues, to have permanent, multi-factional, revolutionary ferment there, so nobody ever gets control, while all the while it's all about not oil, but gas, gas, gas. Here's David Malone. There is an Islamic pipeline, isn't there?
There's actually such a complex network of pipelines. I think people don't realize just how many pipelines there are. Europe is, if you see a map of the gas pipelines across the whole of Europe, it looks like the road network. It's so complicated. But in that area, there are a couple of really important pipelines. There's what's been called the Islamic pipeline, which would run from Iran across the top of Syria and on into Europe. Obviously, that pipeline is supported by Russia, and not at all popular in America, because it would give Iran easy access, direct access to Europe for its gas, which would put a crowbar into America's policy of isolating Iran, because Europe would say, we need the gas, thank you, Iran, and that's the end of that. So I think it's very interesting that just in the last couple of days, America suddenly gave Europe a 6-month exemption to the oil embargo from Iran. So I think they saw this possibility and said, crikey, we better do something about this. So that's the Islamic pipeline. Then there's the old Arab pipeline, which is basically how Egyptian gas is moved up to supply Jordan and Lebanon. So it runs up from Egypt and then up the coast. That pipeline is one of the pipelines that Qatar is very interested in, because Qatar had suggested to its Saudi neighbor, could we please run a pipeline from us across Saudi and up to Turkey, which would be perfect for Qatar. And Saudi said, no. That was the end of that. So that left Qatar saying, right, well, maybe we could hook into this admittedly slightly creaking Egyptian-built pipeline. And all they would need to do is essentially build another, I think it's about 60 kilometers on the top, just to connect it up across the border into Turkey. And once it got there, then there's already pipelines that run from Turkey which could feed into Europe. And then there's another pipeline which was a major proposal called Nabucco, and it essentially would be a large capacity pipeline which would run across Turkey and was going to end up in Austria. They could have connected, the Qatar gas supply through the Arab pipeline into that, and then bingo, you've got a massive supply running into Europe. What happened in, I think it was 2009, is the Syrian government had tentatively said yes, they would do this, and Russia obviously hadn't objected. But at the time, it was simply, I think, just to move Egyptian gas further up to Turkey, and I think Russia was okay with that. When in about 2009, 2010, Qatar said, "Oh, please, can we join the party? Could we use this pipeline for our gas?" I think at that point Russia thought, "Oh, okay, that changes things completely. This isn't about a few 100 million cubic feet of gas to be nice to Turkey. This would be a game changer. This would change the nature of the energy supplies into Europe." And Russia's not in favor of that. Russia is the number one supplier of gas into Europe. A quarter of all Russian government income comes from the sale of gas into Europe. A quarter of all their official government income. Syria is really the nexus of a lot of conflicting interests, which center on gas, really. I think what's going on there is Qatar desperately needs, and over the last several years has made every attempt to be able to connect its largest gas field, it's the largest gas field in the world, to Europe by pipeline. If it did that, it would probably be able to double its output. And unfortunately, its neighbor, Saudi, really doesn't want this to happen. Saudi, to boil it down, Saudi is about oil, Qatar is about gas. And with Europe, the UK being the lead, but also France and Spain, and France, increasingly turning to liquefied natural gas, which is what we get from Qatar. This really begins to cut into Saudi's dominance. And I think that's a large part of what is going on, is that I really think Saudi is the old hegemonic power in the Middle East, and I think Qatar is the rising power. I think Saudi has realized this, doesn't like it, and has done everything it can to block every attempt by Qatar to run a
It's
pipeline.
interesting you say that Saudi is the old hegemonic power, because, of course, the House of Saud is a relatively new entity altogether.
Quite. Speaking about old and new in the Middle East, one has a very short timescale. But I generally do see Saudi and America as being the hegemonic alliance. I just think that Qatar has got fed up with that and thought, what can we do to get out from underneath the thumb of Saudi? And I think they've been playing a very clever game. If you look at what they've done across the Arab Spring, it has been very proactive, where Saudi essentially sat back slightly aghast and thought, we don't like all of these rumblings of political change, because of course they feel quite vulnerable to such themselves, and therefore were not on the side of change. Qatar has made it very clear to its across North Africa and the Middle East that it is on the side of change, its version of change, which is perhaps not exactly the same as our version of change, and they've supported the Muslim Brotherhood in every country, which means they were one of the first countries to support the uprising in Libya. They were the major supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and in Yemen. So Qatar has said, we want to get out from underneath Saudi. Why don't we make ourselves into a regional power? The Arab Spring, I think, presented itself as a God-given opportunity for them. And they seized the opportunity and have built themselves a regional power. They are seen as the change you can believe in, Arab style. And then I think something else has happened, and that is that there's been a coming together. I don't think either of these countries planned it from the start. I don't think one needs to imagine that. But I think France has looked at what's happened with Qatar and said, here's an opportunity for us. And so I think you see an emerging new alliance, just as you had Saudi and America as the old alliance, the still hegemonic, but I think in decline alliance. I think what you're going to see in the next few years is a new alliance of Qatar and France. And I think that is the alliance which is active in the whole region and in Syria right now. I think it explains why of all the European countries was France the one to say, yes, we will join America. I mean, I just remember recently when America had nothing good to say about France because it wouldn't support them in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's a question which needs to be answered, and I don't see anyone asking it. And I think the answer is because I think France is going to be fighting, well, potentially standing side by side with America, but I don't think they're on the same page.
So this is not about Sunni versus Shia. This is not about the Arab Spring or democracy, but in fact it's about oil independence. Is that an overstatement on my part?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I would say we've got to get used to speaking more about gas than oil. I mean, oil is the term we always used for petrochemical energy in the past. I think we've got to move away. Certainly in Europe, this is the age of gas, not oil. Gas is the thing which, and getting your hands on it, which will either give you political independence or make you politically dependent on someone being Russia. It's what all the governments in Europe are looking for. And so I do think just as there are conflicts in Africa, which you think, is it this tribe, is it that tribe? No, it's blood diamonds. Here, we're talking about blood gas.
A so-called limited strike would be considered by some to be economically worthwhile because it is so often a pump prime for any economy.
I think in this particular circumstance, I'm not sure that America's interest is to do with any access to energy for itself. I think America has been working hard on disentangling itself from reliance on the Middle East. I mean, the bulk of your oil imports come from Canada these days, I believe, and that will probably increase. I think America is disentangling itself from the Middle East. I think it's fed up and sees it as for what it is, which is increasingly unstable. I think America's interests in this are not directly to do with energy. I actually think that there is no settled, unified American strategy right now. I think America's actually been caught slightly on the hop. And I think there are probably different groups within the American governing machinery. And I put it that way because I think the Congress may have a set of views. I think the intelligence community may have a different set of views, and the military may have a different set of views, and Wall Street may have another. And I think it's not quite clear to America, the American governing machine, what they should go for. I think they've always been Saudi's partner because Saudi supplied oil. Saudi was the largest member of OPEC. It was the power. I think they're now thinking, well, maybe Qatar is going to be the rising power. How do you disentangle yourself from being the ally of the old number one power and quietly say to another one, actually, we'd like to be with you? That's a very difficult thing to do because you might end up with nothing. You might annoy the partner you used to have and not get the one you'd like. So I think America is, it's not clear what they want to do. And I think that's why this morning it's been a case of Putin 1, Obama 0, completely outplayed, because I think Russia has a very clear agenda, and I think America does not have a clear agenda. There are several possibilities, and I don't think they know which one to go for.
So what about Iran? Because it's not simply nuclear or no nuclear, is it? That's what is fed to the masses.
No, it's absolutely not that. It's the convenient story because it fits into a nutshell. It makes good sound bites, but it is most definitely not that. At the moment, it's absolutely not that. At the moment, it's about gas. I'm sorry to come back to it, but unless you figure gas into your equation, you'll be surprised by everything and won't see anything coming. The big supplier, one of the big suppliers to a Russian pipeline, which would run into Europe, would come from Iran. That's one of the suppliers. That would be a wonderful thing for Iran and shatter the American policy to try and isolate Iran, and would greatly benefit Russia, because Russia doesn't mind other people's gas running into Europe as long as those other people are Russia's allies.
So a putative regime change in Iran, which Tony Blair has recently vociferously yet again been pushing for.
Well, where you've put your finger on it. If you have a regime change, that's not the end of the story, that's the beginning. Okay, so let's say you get rid of Assad and his regime. But who's the new regime? Is the new regime going to be influenced by Qatar? They've spent 3 billion euros, I think, supporting the rebels, so they're expecting to have a say. If it's pro-Qatar, it's pro-pipeline, Qatar's gas flows into Europe. If there's a regime change, but Saudi, who are now outspending Qatar, they get to choose, then the regime will be anti that pipeline, and there won't be one, and Qatar will have to look for something else. If there's a regime change and Russia has a big say in it, or there isn't a regime change, then there's going to be a pipeline, but it will be running gas from Iran and maybe from the Caspian Basin. So having regime change is to say nothing at all.
As indeed we've seen in Iraq. post-war Iraq, though of course it's not post-war because there are bombs that go off every day.
Well, the Iraq example, I would say two things. One, it's early days. It may seem like a long time, but in terms of building pipelines and establishing who does what, it's early days. So it may well still change the nature of whose oil and gas flows where. But you're right, it certainly hasn't so far. And I think there's another a much darker possibility, which I think is one to keep in mind for what could be going on in Syria. And that is that there was a notion in the dim dark past that the Allies were going to walk into Iraq and flowers would be thrown in front of the tanks and we'd be hailed as liberators. Obviously that didn't happen. So what has happened there? We have a situation which is barely governable, something just above civil war. Who's to say that they haven't looked at that lesson and thought, well, would that be really terrible to have in Syria? I mean, we assume that what people want is rid of one regime to get another regime, a nice, stable government. And maybe that is what they would like. But another possibility was that if you want to contain radical Islam, find a place where you can set up where they'll all kill each other. Have a place that's in a permanent state of anarchy that sucks in different warring factions who are so busy killing each other. And you see the beginnings of this already in Syria, in that the al-Nusra rebels, who are allegedly, and for all I know, they are affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They're certainly of that ilk. They are already at daggers drawn with Hezbollah. Now that's rather convenient. Two groups that the West doesn't like, being drawn into a conflict where they're going to start killing each other.
And then what about the question of Kurdistan? Because this is also relevant because you had secession.
Yes, and that could be the blueprint, that you don't need the whole of the old country, Iraq, to be a wonderful place to live. You can let some of it descend into anarchy, as long as the bit that you're concerned about, you hive off into a functioning economic unit, as you say, in this case, Kurdistan. The poor old Kurds have had a rough trot in history. They always used and frequently abused. I mean, Henry Kissinger sold them out appallingly at the 11th hour, and they were slaughtered. He sold them out to Saddam. And the Kurds are not going to get Turkey to agree to giving them their own homeland. So I don't see this necessarily as the dawning of a wonderful new age for the Kurds. I think the Kurds will continue to be used and shafted, unfortunately.
Where does this leave people who do not like what is going on, of course for humanitarian reasons? Where does it leave those people who say, oh, well, David Malone, you're just a complete cynic?
I don't think it's down solely to gas. What I don't want to do is replace one fairy tale simple story with another one. The fact of the matter is, in any conflict, there isn't just two sides. We want this, they want that, and we're at war. It's not sort of World War II scenario where you've got the people in the black hats and the people in the white hats. What you really have is a mess of conflicting agendas, which what annoys me is when our leadership and our media boil it down to a simple fairy story of white hats and black hats, and then say, so let's go and get the people with the black hats. And it never is that. If people knew what the real agenda was and then said, we still think we should go to war, I wouldn't particularly like it, but I would say, fine. You've decided on the basis of proper analysis. We don't have a proper analysis in the mainstream media. At least I can't find it. And that bothers me, because then people are being hoodwinked, essentially.
But you maintain that amongst all this messy story, there's a hardcore series of economic issues that must be studied.
I think you need to know who you're fighting for and what you're fighting for. It's about whether Europe is dependent on Russia for gas, whether that gas comes from Iran, and if America and France do end up fighting, they'll be standing side by side, but they'll be actually fighting for completely different outcomes. They won't actually really be in alliance. Now, I think people just need to think about it, know it, and then make their decision. Otherwise, they're just sleepwalking into something.
What about the feedback you're getting on your blog? That too is very interesting.
Yeah, well, that's what really makes the blog fantastic. Is I think I've managed to gravitate some of the most intelligent commenters around. I think that's what makes the blog what it is, really. And just yesterday, I had an email from an American saying, "Is anyone else giving this analysis? Where can I find it?" So I'm going to write back to him and say, "Listen to your radio station," because he was just an American who was saying, "Where can I read more? Why isn't this being available in the States?" So, and an awful lot of the security intelligence organizations read it.
Well, David Malone, thank you very much for speaking today to KGNU and It's the Economy.
Thank you very much indeed.